It is just after midnight here on the East Coast, 12:13 to be exact, and this is a post AEW pay-per-view edition of Wrestling Night in America. I am your host, Brandon LeClair, pwtorch contributor and also alt perspective reporter for AEW pay-per-views and WWE premium live events. As you probably guessed, we are here tonight to talk about AEW Full Gear 2024. The show just wrapped up about 15 minutes ago. They were live from the Prudential Center in Newark, New Jersey tonight. Really good crowd on hand, one of the larger crowds for AEW, at least television-wise, in a bit, notwithstanding like major shows like the Wembley events. And a nice looking crowd, a nice sounding crowd throughout the night. We've got plenty of matches, plenty of stuff to get into and talk about. As always, VIP members are welcome to join the conversation here, both on the live broadcast on the PW Torch YouTube, Twitch, and Facebook page, and also in those respective comment sections. And you can also, as I said, sound off in the comments, sound off here. If you are a VIP member, you are welcome to join us. We can put you up on the screen. Or if you would prefer to just do the old school way of calling in, that is certainly an option as well. You don't need to put your face up here, but we certainly welcome it. And I am not going to be talking about this show alone. Last month, I made a joke that it only took, like a month before longtime host of this show, Greg Parks, showed up to contribute to the program once again. And guess what? He is back. I would like to welcome the one and only Greg Parks back to Wrestling Night in America to go over another show with me. Greg, welcome back.
It's great to be here, Brandon. You're doing a fantastic job.
Why, thanks. So far, I've only hosted, I've done a lot of these shows with you as your co-host. Mm-hmm. And so far, I've only hosted 3, and you've been my co-host for 2. So not a lot of variety, but I'll take it. I'm fine with it.
I don't want to be the guy, I coached soccer for 11 years at the middle school level. And this year I'm taking the year off because, as many of you know, my wife's going to be giving birth next month, and I can't commit to that. So, I told the new coach, who, by the way, is one of my former players, which is really weird. But I said, hey, I'd like to stay involved. If I can come to a practice or two and help out, I'm happy to do that. And he was very welcoming. And they started conditioning the other day, and it was the first time they had, this was the first event without me coaching in 11 years. And I'm like, I kind of want to go out there, I'm free, I'm available. I was like, I don't want to step on the new coach's toes right away. I don't want him to feel like I'm looking over his shoulder. I don't want, the kids to not see him as the head coach because they used to seeing me as the head coach. So I kind of feel that way here. Like, I don't want you to feel like I'm stepping on your toes or that you need to look over your shoulder at me or anything. But yeah, it is just happenstance that I've been on 2 of the 3 times you've hosted.
I'm terrified. I know you're coming back. You're coming back for this job. I'm shaking.
Breathing down your neck, Brandon.
Yep. Yeah. Just can't get away. Can't get away from him. Wade let me know earlier it would be you, and I was just like, man, it just can never be anybody else. No, I was actually as we said off air in our quote unquote production meeting. I was happy to learn, though a little surprised to see that Greg would be joining me tonight for this show. So happy to have you here as always. We'll be talking AEW this time. Like I said, to start the show, you are certainly welcome to join us in the chat, or if you are a VIP member, via video call or audio call. We will certainly take your questions, discuss them live as we run through the show. But otherwise, we'll be talking about this thing in chronological order. I think that works best for the flow of our conversation. So we'll go ahead and start there. Greg, as I kick the show off mentioning, this is AEW's 2024 iteration of Full Gear. It was live at the Prudential Center tonight in Newark, New Jersey. a really good crowd. I thought that it looked really good, which is something that AEW has struggled with a lot of TV events lately. And I know you and I have talked about that before. I've talked about it with Wade on some of the other post shows, but I thought the crowd was notable tonight. Anything stand out there to you?
I thought it was kind of an okay crowd. I didn't think it was any
Okay.
great shakes. Size-wise, yes, I think they drew over 10,000 for
Right.
this one, with a lot of tickets sold in the last couple weeks. I know that
Mhm.
they were stuck at 6,000 for a while, so that's a good sign for them. As far as the reactions, I didn't think it was great. I thought there was a lot of matches that at least started weak, and maybe in credit to the wrestlers and the stories they were telling in the matches that sort of progressed into willing the fans into things. But I thought there were a lot of moments more than usual because and AEW does have a high bar, I think, with its crowds. In turn, especially pay-per-views. We've seen some really dead crowds over the last few months for TVs, but
Mhm.
pay-per-views, those crowds seem to be pretty hyped throughout the show. Toward the end, they kind of trail off because it's a long show. But
Yeah.
one of the first things I noticed was the opener, the multi-team tag match, and the opener is usually the crowd is super engaged, super with it,
Mhm.
and this was. I thought the crowd was dead from the start. There were a couple of moments that were designed to get a crowd reaction in that match that I thought didn't until the very end. So I thought this was probably one of the lesser crowds in terms of consistent reactions throughout the show,
Mhm.
but that's because AEW has such a high bar with their crowd reactions in pay-per-views throughout its history.
Yeah, I should know. I didn't necessarily think that the crowd audibly stood out in any particular positive way. I want to just reiterate. I was more so speaking about, like you said, Greg, the size
Yeah.
where they have had such an issue even framing these buildings as of late because of
Mhm.
how empty they are. The fact that they were able to do circle crane shots tonight was a pretty big improvement in and of itself. I thought that there were times where the crowd was hot, especially like in the middle of the show, which is sort of runs counter to what I think I typically expect with these pay-per-views. But I think you're right. The beginning, the opening tag match, which we'll get into here in a minute, and then as the show waned on, the final two matches, it seemed like they had a hard time staying up, including what I thought was sort of a downer of a situation to close out the show, and I think
Mhm.
that kind of contributed to how the crowd was reacting to that. But let's go ahead and start right there at the beginning. You've touched upon it a little bit here. Opening match on the main card was a four-way tag team match for the AEW World Tag Team Championships. When the show opened up, the three challengers were already in the ring. That was, of course, the Acclaimed, the Outrunners, and Kings of the Black Throne. Private Party was the only one to receive a televised pay-per-view entrance. I think the other teams entered on 0 hour. Private Party retains the championships in 13 minutes and 20 seconds. This was their first title defense. Greg, what did you think of the match?
Not one of AEW's better openers. I mean, it was decent, but again, just kind of like the crowd reactions on pay-per-views, AEW has set a pretty high bar for their openers. Those are always the matches that seem to kick off pay-per-views on a really strong note for AEW, historically speaking. And this one wasn't that. I thought it was a good win for Private Party. Beating the Young Bucks for the titles was a big moment for them, and to be on pay-per-view for your first title defense and to defend it against three other teams, I think was an important milestone win for them. So I liked that. The Acclaimed, I think, took a lot of the focus because of the issues that developed between Anthony Bowens and Max Caster during
Mhm.
the match. I noted on social media, I'm not really sure if I would prefer a heel turn from the Acclaimed or if I would prefer a breakup of the Acclaimed. I'm not sure, if you're looking to get the most success out of Bowens and Caster, is it as separate singles or will it come as a heel team. And we've seen MVP approaching, specifically Max Caster, to encourage him to join the Hurt Syndicate. But I do wonder, you've got a singles in Bobby Lashley, you've got a singles in Shelton Benjamin. I wonder if adding a tag team to the Hurt Syndicate would be a smart move. So that's going to be a lot of the discussion coming out of this. And Private Party's win, I think, is going to be minimized a little bit by the discussion that's going to come surrounding the Acclaimed in the coming days and weeks. But a solid win for Private Party, but I didn't think all that much of the match.
Yeah, I mean, you and I haven't discussed this at all beforehand, and I left this feeling very similarly that it was a fine match, but it largely was built around, like you said, the drama surrounding the Acclaimed. And it's sort of unfortunate to be focused so heavily on that when you're trying to get over this relatively underestablished tag team as your new champions and focal point of the division. I thought that
Mhm.
Private Party looked good, and the other teams in the match looked good for the most part. Everybody got their spots. It did have that AEW tag team conundrum of whenever they have these big multi-man matches, especially multi-man tag matches, the referee loses order very quickly and very rarely makes any attempt to try to reestablish that order. So very quickly you lose track of the legal men, and the announcers don't try to figure it out, and the referee doesn't try to figure it out. And you can just imagine how ornery Jim Ross would be on commentary if he were calling this particular match, because he would just have no clue what was going on, and he would get really pissed really fast.
And
So
he
I
doesn't
think
have
there's
the filter anymore to
right.
stop himself
Yeah.
from saying that and pointing that out.
Yeah, he's just gonna say it. So good that they didn't have him on commentary on this match. Although maybe if they did, they would think to rein it in a little. I don't know.
Mhm.
Yeah, I didn't think much of this aside from, like you said, the continued breakdown of communication between the Acclaimed and where we're to go from here with them. I think that uh, each of the teams got decent reactions throughout the match. The only team that didn't seem to have the crowd behind them in some way or another was the Acclaimed, and that was, as we learned as the match progressed, really just an indictment of Max Caster, not Anthony Bowens. So yeah, I mean, an okay opener, but certainly, like you said, I think on the weaker end of openers as far as AEW pay-per-views go. This seems like it probably would have fared a little bit better in the middle of the show, rather being an opener where typically you want to start the crowd off hot with a story they're invested in, and there just wasn't much of a story to tell here.
There just weren't those domineering personalities among these
No.
4 teams that's going to get the crowd into it, whether, as baby faces or as heels. Private Party, they don't have those personalities that the fans glom onto. The Outrunners are kinda hit or miss. There are some crowds that love them, some crowds that really don't get the shtick, and so that's always going to be hit or miss. Kings of the Black Throne, kind of the brooding heels. I don't know. I feel like they've kind of run their course, and fans just see them as normal heels that don't really fire up the crowd in any negative way. And then, the Acclaimed once was that act, that they were once that
Mhm.
act that jumped off the page and got the crowd to react. But because they're going through some things right now, their personalities have become a lot more muted and they don't stand out in the way they once did. So I do wonder if that was part of the crowd reaction, is you don't have those either those personalities that jump off the page and kind of grab the fans and shake them into reacting, or it's not the main event level teams that have been established as main eventers like FTR, like the Young Bucks, or a team like
Mhm.
that.
Yeah, I applaud them in a way for trying to establish some other teams. I think there's been a pretty good lineage of really talented teams in AEW, but the one disadvantage to not including acts like that is that you wind up with a match like this where it doesn't feel particularly important and it's harder to get the crowd invested on any significant level. I'm still hopeful that in the long run there's going to be a recentering and a refocus on the tag division because it was once such a strong piece of AEW's lineage and something that really separated them, I thought, in a positive way from WWE that they have lost over time.
Mhm. Yeah, I've written about
Before
that
we,
in
yeah,
in
go
in
ahead.
my Torch columns before too, of AEW and what can be done about their tag division, because I agree,
Mhm,
that is, if you're AEW and you're trying to differentiate yourself from WWE, as they seem to do when they began, one way to do that, and again, they did this, was to emphasize the tag division because that was nothing that Vince McMahon ever really pushed seriously
mhm,
or over a long term. Now that Triple H is in charge, we're seeing a little bit more focus on the tag division, but certainly AEW has them beat at least by numbers. They certainly have more tag teams than WWE does. So I too, I would like to see them give a little bit more focus to the tag teams as a way for them to, just an easy way for them to stand out as a company. A lot of people are complaining that AEW is kind of losing viewers because they're becoming too much like WWE circa 5, 6 years ago, or they haven't differentiated enough from WWE. And, you know, re-establishing the tag division as a main event division or as a division that is seen as equal footing with the men would be one way to do that.
yeah, yeah, definitely. Before we get too deep in the weeds here, just on the card, the full card rundown, want to highlight a couple of comments here. Chris J just saying pay-per-view was okay, but way too long for an okay pay-per-view, and that's sort of an overarching theme here that we often see with these shows. Greg, sort of big picture. Joshua White kind of echoing the same sentiment. Good pay-per-view, but still too long. It's a comment that we see frequently with these shows. You and I have talked about it several times as well. It's kind of you're gonna get what you're gonna get with
Mhm.
AEW. They're going to give you a 4 hour show, and you either like it or you don't. But it seems to be their mo with absolutely no intent on mixing it up.
4 hour shows are hard to take when it's a really good show, at least for me.
Hmm.
Um, there's just not a lot of patience for one if it's not. And
Right.
AEW's credit, they've been able to hit that mark of really good shows quite often, to the point where, yes, people were still complaining about the length of shows, but it was tempered a little bit because the quality was so high. Once you
Mhm.
start running into, hey, this was an okay show, people are going to have a lot less patience for 4 hour shows or 5 hours if you're counting the pre-show. Um, you know, that's not to say that AEW is and Tony Khan are going out of their way to try to make an okay show. Obviously, every show that they put on, they're going to try to hit that same mark that they hit for some of the better shows in AEW's history. Um, but I mean, that's just going to be the reaction. And for a show like this that was not certainly in the upper echelon, I thought it was a good show, but it wasn't in the upper echelon of, if I'm grading it out of a 10, it's not a 9 or a 9.5 that I've given some AEW shows in the past.
Sure.
Then that patience for that length of a show wears out, especially, when WWE is doing really good shows themselves and they're able to fit it into a 3 hour window, which is much more manageable for a lot of people, even on a Saturday night.
Yeah, definitely. Getting back into the actual meat of the card here, we'll go to the second match. MJF taking on Roderick Strong. This was advertised potentially originally as a three-way match. Had Adam Cole been able to win his three consecutive matches in the story leading up to this affair, he was not, and therefore we got the one-on-one match between MJF and Roderick Strong. MJF, the winner, in just under 14 minutes. He applies the Salt of the Earth armbar after a weak pinfall attempt from Roddy. coming off of after a brain buster. Interesting match. I thought that this was the start of a trend on this show, which was very, very focused body work, which is not something that AEW has frequently done. We are used to seeing a lot of high spots, a lot of blood and gore, a lot of finisher spamming, the whole 9 yards, and not often does a show revolve so heavily around the exploitation of specific body parts and injury. And I I hesitate to say that I loved it in totality because part of me feels like they went a little heavy-handed on it, and I think that this is an issue that we've seen demonstrated with AEW in the past, is that unlike, say, WWE, who seems to have, uh, sort of an understanding amongst the various producers and agents working on a show, oftentimes the construction of an AEW pay-per-view feels very segmented, and one match has not been informed of the next or the next or the next, and as a result you get a lot of repeated spots and repeated ideas and things that maybe you should have left for later on, or things that have already been done by the time it gets to you. And that was an issue tonight where there was just a ton of body work. And most of it was really good. So I don't want to come down too hard on it because I think as a whole, AEW could stand to use more of it, but it felt in a way like an overcorrection tonight. Did you pick up on that, Greg, starting with this match and then going through?
Not only that, but it was the teased count out spots as well. There
Hmm.
were quite a few
Hmm.
of those in the show, and this is, as you mentioned, this is a symptom that has run throughout AEW's pay-per-views in the past, where it seems like the producers don't talk to each other. And what I
Hmm.
don't get is presumably, and maybe I'm wrong on this, presumably producers and wrestlers are watching other matches on the card, and by the
Right.
time you get to the third or fourth match where there's a body part work, or the third or fourth match where there's a teased countout spot, maybe you talk amongst yourselves and say, "Hey, let's cut that out. Let's do a different thing here. Let's take out the teased countout spot and let's put something else in its place because we've now seen it 3 times." But no, now we see it a fourth time. So that's what I don't get. Like, I mean, it's one thing to seem like that the producers are not talking to each other, but it's another to continue it on throughout the show and to not have anyone stand up and say, "Hey, maybe we shouldn't do this for the fifth match in a row. Maybe if this was planned because we've seen what's happened before, maybe let's put something else in its place." That's strange to me as well.
Yeah, for anyone who didn't see it, the focus in this particular match was Roderick Strong's hand. MJF went to work on it very early on in the match, and they just told the story throughout that Strong didn't have as much power behind a lot of his backbreakers and backdrops and whatnot because MJF was working so diligently on the hand, and the finish came as a direct result where Roddy hits a brainbuster and he goes to cover MJF with just an arm draped over MJF, and Max quickly turns it into Salt of the Earth, and Roddy ends up tapping almost immediately to the point that the announcers made a very specific point to harp on the fact that, oh, Roderick Strong must have had a serious injury to either his fingers or his hand or his wrist because otherwise he wouldn't have tapped that quickly. So they really hammered home the idea that MJF had injured the wrist or finger or hand of Roderick Strong, and that's what led to the very quick tap out. Uh, I thought it was, a good match, as you would expect these two to have. Nothing particularly noteworthy. I thought what was noteworthy was the fact that you still had a crowd that was treating MJF as a babyface at times, despite the very clear attempt to really push him back into that heel category. So much so that they kind of went heavy-handed with him grabbing a mic and cutting a quick promo on not just Strong but the crowd as well. Greg, do you read in at all to the notion that the crowd is still getting behind MJF, or do you think it's just something the AEW crowd's going to do?
Yeah, I think certain crowds will. I don't. I'm not sure that the bulk of them will. Because I think Adam Cole is still pretty popular, although there's been some
Mhm.
shakiness with that since his return. But I attribute that to the same thing that I felt about this match, which it was a good match, but I can't get into it because the story with MJF and Cole is so convoluted.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, how many twists and turns has there been necessitated by injury and other things that have gone on between these two guys since they first got together? And so it's just hard for me to follow. It's hard for me to follow the characters' motivations. It's hard for me to look back on this storyline and draw a straight line from point A to point B to point C to where we are today.
You
And
can't.
you can't. And so AEW could have done one or two things. They soldiered on through it, which they did, or just dropped it and had each guy go their separate ways. And that is looking like more and more the way that they should have gone in hindsight. So
And it
it's
seemed
just
like the way they were going too.
yeah, I mean, I can't necessarily fault them for giving it a go because they had spent so much time on the
Mhm.
MJF Cole relationship that they wanted to get to a payoff eventually to it, right? And
Yeah.
there needed to be some more building to that. So they gave it a shot, but what they've come out with since Cole has returned really hasn't made a lot of sense. And I don't think it makes Adam Cole the character look very good. I'm not sure that there's a lot more interest in MJF after this. I think you could make the argument that it may have damaged the MJF character a little bit. Maybe it helps Roderick Strong a little bit because he's wrestling MJF on pay per view and in a pretty visible AEW storyline still. But the match was okay. I just can't get into it because the story is so convoluted.
Yeah. After the match, before we move on, just want to touch on post-match antics. The Adam Cole, Mike Bennett, Matt Taven group, Undisputed Kingdom, I guess, rush to the ring to swarm around Roddy. MJF escapes the ring, and Cole is kind of talking trash to MJF as he leaves. Kyle O'Reilly is in the mix too, and Adam Cole, when he goes to check on Strong, O'Reilly shoves him to the mat. So they're teasing some dissent there, whether or not Cole can be trusted, whether or not he's got Roddy's best interests at heart. So they've got, teasing more dissension with O'Reilly and Cole. And it just doesn't really seem like it's working all that
Yeah.
well. And Cole's got the stuff going on with the conglomeration too. So he's kind of split between two major issues right now. Uh, so yeah, anything to add about the post match stuff?
It feels like too much. It's just too
Yeah.
much to take in, too much to digest. It's kind of similar to what happened at the end of the show. Like it was just too much going on. It's just you got to give fans something and let them digest it, let them think about it, let them consider it. But when you're doing boom, 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 going from and like you said, Adam Cole is involved in like two or three separate things. He's involved
Mhm.
with the stuff with MJF. He's involved with the stuff with Roddy, and the Kingdom, and he's involved with Kyle O'Reilly and the conglomeration, and it's just too much.
Yeah. Turning the page to the only women's match on this show, something AEW has been really good at avoiding in recent months, but not tonight. Just a single women's match. Though I thought that they made excellent use of their time. This to me is where things really started to pick up. Mercedes Monet retaining her TBS championship in 19 minutes 24 seconds over the babyface Chris Statlander. I thought this match was excellent. One of the better matches in the women's division that I've seen in a little while. And I thought that they had some negative inertia working against them going in, just because they did such a poor job setting up this babyface turn or lack of a turn for Chris Statlander. And I really thought that it hurt her character and her connection with the audience. But she was just so good in this match, and Monet was so good at selling for her that I thought that they largely overcame all of those issues. A lot of great hope spots where it seemed like the crowd was really, really invested and thought that there was a real strong chance that Statlander would come out on top. This was another match where they did, some heavy body work stuff with Monet working over the formerly injured knee of Chris Statlander and really, really driving that point home. But I thought this was a really, really good match. Might have been, I don't know. I guess I'll think about it a little bit more as we talk through the rest of the show because I haven't had a chance to do my analysis yet in my report for pwtorch. But this might have been my favorite match of the night. I thought that they exceeded expectations. They certainly exceeded my expectations, and just had a really, really stellar back and forth, technical, smart wrestled match.
To me, this was a show with peaks and valleys. I think we started off the first two matches were kind of the valleys, and then we start hitting the peaks here with Mercedes versus Statlander because I agree. I thought this was a fantastic match. I think that Mercedes Monet has shown that she does a really good job with wrestlers the size of Chris Statlander. And
Hmm.
so she has very good chemistry with wrestlers of that size. And so that was excellent. I thought that the finish was really well done. I'm not sure, if it was if it developed exactly as they had planned, but they made it work. And I thought it was really interesting that Camille didn't get involved. I
Hmm.
don't really know what they're doing with Camille and Mercedes Monet. That's kind of a strange situation to me, but it probably it took a lot of restraint, I think, to not have Camille come out and continue to play into whatever they're doing with her in some fashion here and just have Mercedes get the victory. So I applaud them for that. I applaud them for going with the clean finish here. And I think it helped. I think getting Camille involved or having some kind of finish involving her would have put a damper on the quality of the match. And so to
Hmm.
have it end clean, I think really is going to help people keep this match in high regard.
Yeah, they're telling an interesting story with Mercedes and Camille, and I'll give them that. I mean, I highlighted in my report for pwtorch that the announcers specifically harped on the fact as Mercedes was coming to the ring that Monet requested that Camille stay in the back, that she not be involved in this match because of her failure to keep Statlander away from the title. So basically, the idea that the boss in this case, the CEO Mercedes Monet is showing her protege how it's done because the protege couldn't get it done. She couldn't keep
Mhm.
her away from challenging for the title, and I think that's an interesting story, a compelling story, and not one that we're used to seeing all the time. So I applaud them for that, and yeah, just I don't have enough good things to say about this. I like I said, I thought that it was the highlight for women's wrestling in AEW in quite a while, and I think you hit it. Monet is great with this type of opponent, and she is continues to be in situations where it calls for it one of the best sellers in the business. I think that's why she has earned the reputation that she has as far as her in-ring prowess. She is just incredibly believable in the ring, especially with an opponent like Statlander. So yeah, I just all around positive with that one, and like we both kind of said, this is where I think the show started to pick up a bit. Moving in now to a series of non-title matches, a bunch of grudge matches that they had kind of lined up right in a row here. The first being the rematch from last month's Wrestle Dream, Jay White facing Hangman Adam Page. Jay White wins this one again in just shy of 20 minutes. He catches catches Hangman with the what's the finish? I'm drawing a blank. The
Ugh. I'm not great with finisher
Blade
names these
Runner, the
days.
Blade Runner.
Okay.
He hit the Blade Runner. He catches Hangman with the Blade Runner after. So that what they did was they did a callback to the finish from last month's match where Hangman goes for the buckshot lariat, but White catches him in the Blade Runner. This time around, they go for the same thing, except Hangman telegraphs the Blade Runner this time, slips through it, but then gets caught on the rebound. So White hits the move anyway, gets the win over Hangman Page. I thought this was again a really good match, but they went really heavy-handed on selling the injury, working the body part, and in this case, not just once but twice, because it was Hangman who worked over the newly injured ankle of Jay White that he hurt during the course of this match, and then it was Jay White exposing the lower leg of Hangman Page that he injured in the last match that these two had. So there was a lot of back and forth body work here that we had already seen in the last match and the match before that. Uh, Anything that you wanted to add in particular about this one, Greg?
I thought it was really good. I'm not sure I loved it as much as I loved the match from last month,
Mm-hmm.
but I think it was still a really strong match. I think Hangman Page in a company where we seem to be having a dearth of compelling characters. I think Hangman Page is one of the most interesting to me. So I am into the things that he's doing, and so Jay White here. I mean, the problem is partially Jay White is not a lot different than Jay White the heel. Jay White the babyface
Mm-hmm.
that we're seeing now. And
Yeah.
I would like to see a little bit more differentiation there, but I think he's primed for a strong run. You know, we saw him get involved there at the end of the show with John Moxley, one of what seems like three challengers for Moxley that was set up there at the end after he beat Orange Cassidy. So that may not be next month, but it could be further down the line, which I think is fine. I think, you know, continue to build him, continue to build his babyface credentials, and have him be a guy that Moxley faces 2-3 months down the line. I'm fine with that. But Page and White here was a good match, and I'm interested to see where they go next with both of these characters.
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm continuously compelled by Hangman Adam Page, and I think that he has been one of the bigger success stories in terms of long-term storytelling and long-term story arcing in AEW. They've taken a great deal of care with his character and have set him down logical paths based on the things that have happened to him and the things that he himself have committed, which is not something that you can always say about. Like, I look at a character like Swerve Strickland, for example, who was embroiled with Hangman Adam Page for the better part of a year, and there had to be some concessions with buying into the babyface nature of that character because of all the things that he did as a heel. Whereas with Hangman Page, his slow descent into madness has conveniently lined up with a heel turn instead of the other way around. And so they're able to get away with him committing these increasingly heinous acts while his character takes that descent and goes down that plunge. And so I think it's worked really well. I think that his commitment to the character has worked very well. You and I talked last month on the Wrestle Dream edition of this show and said that if there were any major character in AEW that could afford to take a loss to Jay White, it would probably be Hangman Adam Page. Does your opinion on that still stand now that we've seen it happen twice in largely the same fashion?
I think you have to weigh who needs to win more. Is it Jay White or Adam Page? And I think that Page's character and his aggressiveness allows him to make up for losses.
Mhm.
And Jay White is a guy who had just turned babyface. He is searching for that acceptance as a babyface with the fans, and it's a lot quicker to be accepted as a babyface when you win. So I could make the argument that Jay White winning 2 pay-per-views in a row against Hangman Adam Page, especially if you read into the post-match of the main event that he's going to be
Right.
lined up to face Moxley at some point for the title, that makes it make even more sense. So I'm good with that.
Yeah, I mean, a year tonight removed from the Jay White main event experience with MJF at Full Gear 2023 that did not go particularly well and had a lot of people wondering what is the future for Jay White as a main event player. And now a year later, it looks like we might finally be getting a return to form. This time as a babyface. So
Mhm.
still some pieces to fall into place there, but it does seem like there is certainly a push on the horizon for Jay White. Next up on the card was another grudge match, another really good match as far as I'm concerned. Will Osprey taking on Kyle Fletcher. Don Callis was at ringside on commentary for this one. Kyle Fletcher wins this one in just over 24 minutes after nearly killing Will Osprey in multiple attempts to damage the neck. Another match heavily influenced by bodywork and Kyle Fletcher's constant attacks on the taped up shoulder and back and neck area of Will Osprey. This was the first of 2 matches where we saw a major AEW babyface whom I think many view as face of the company potential take a clean pin uh, to a heel.
Mhm.
One up and coming, one established, but just getting into the company. So obviously we'll talk about the other one later. But now, Greg, what do you think here? What does this mean for Kyle Fletcher? What does it mean for Will Ospreay? What did you think of the match?
I've not been shy about criticizing AEW when I think that they make mistakes or they go against what I consider common sense booking in terms of who's going over.
Mhm.
And I've seen a lot of people online question some of the finishes in terms of who went over on this show. My tastes and my sensibilities, I think, align more with Tony Khan's tonight than the masses. So I was surprised Kyle Fletcher won. I thought, when Kyle Fletcher turned heel, the feud with Will Ospreay was going to be coming, and I thought, okay, Ospreay's going to win, but Fletcher's going to be better off for feuding with him. This is going
Mhm.
to help him because I'm a huge Kyle Fletcher fan. This is going to help legitimize him by hanging in the ring with Will Ospreay, and he can kind of springboard from there. So to see him win here was a surprise, and I think Osprey is. I know he's still quote unquote new to AEW and to the national American audience at large. He's not a guy who came from WWE, who spent years as a main eventer there and then came to AEW. He's a guy who, had successes elsewhere, but maybe not in such a visible way. So I think there's a lot of people who think he still needs to be in establishment mode to the AEW fans, to the curiosity seekers who maybe don't watch AEW every week but tune in every once in a while. I just don't think that's necessarily the case. I don't agree with that premise necessarily. I think Osprey is popular enough and seen as a top guy enough to where he can afford a loss like this. And I think it obviously helps Kyle Fletcher tremendously as he continues to rise above the ranks as a heel. So I had no problem with how the finish was booked. Um, like you said, tremendous match. Probably my match of the night, just a couple hairs above Mercedes Monet and Chris Statlander. But this was everything I think it was cracked up to be. Everything people hoped this match was going to be heading into it. I think it delivered in a big way. And Fletcher getting the victory is interesting. I'm sure we'll get a rematch where Osprey will get the win, but for now, it's a feather in the cap of Kyle Fletcher. As he moves up the card, this is a win that he can brag about, and I think that's going to be good for him.
Yeah, I think that I am sympathetic to both sides of this argument. On one hand, I think that surprising surprising the crowd, surprising the audience with such a huge win for Kyle Fletcher is not a bad thing if you're investing in this character long term. And I do think that establishing a credible act within the Don Callis family beyond just Konosuke Takeshita, who for for as talented as he is, has had his own issues with credibility over the course of time. Just not because of anything that he's done, but because of lack of exposure. I mean, there were times where Takeshita just wasn't featured on the AEW product nearly enough. And so bringing some legitimacy to the Don Callis family by way of a clean win over Will Osprey is in of itself, I think, a net positive. And I think that in the long run, I can be convinced that this is a sound booking strategy if there is a clear direction, purpose, and strategy for Kyle Fletcher going forward. My concern and therefore the caveat that I would have with being comfortable with this win is that there are so many of these guys that AEW has put in this position to succeed and brought up the ranks and tried to catapult into some level of stardom. And they have either been quickly relegated to being a side act just due to the booking, or they have fallen by the wayside for lack of prominent feature. And if you're going to spend a loss of Will Osprey, who I have not been shy about saying, I thought that earlier this year when Osprey came in full time, that that AEW should be in the Will Osprey business. That they should just straight up get in the Will Osprey business, put the rocket on his back, and go to town because he felt like a difference maker. He felt like a guy that stood head and shoulders above the rest. And the last thing that I wanted to see was to borrow a phrase from pwtorch editor Wade Keller, is for Will Ospreay to merge into traffic. And we've seen some of that to some extent. And losing to Kyle Fletcher is another step in that direction if you don't capitalize on what this means long term. And so I see the argument of both sides. I understand the people that are going to dismiss this outright because they say Fletcher is not at Osprey's level. Osprey is too important. Osprey should be in the main event. I get that. And then on the flip side, to the point that you raised, Greg, I completely get the notion that, hey, Fletcher is really, really talented. The Don Callis family needs to be major players in this company going forward. And in order for that to happen, they need to have credible wins against credible opponents.
I agree with you in terms of being in the Will Ospreay business. When he came in, and I thought it was going to take a little more time to get him accepted by the fans as the star that I thought he should be for AEW. But he got in there really quickly. And I think that he has won over the AEW audience very quickly. I think any loss is not going to hurt him because he is such a good wrestler that the fans see him and see the talent that he has. And also, he has a connection with the audience that he was able to connect with them a lot quicker on the mic than I thought he would as a babyface. So I think those two things allow him to, I don't want to say he's Teflon necessarily, but I think he can recover from losses quicker and still be seen as a top babyface, maybe than people give him credit for. But I think if you were going to make the argument that this was not good booking to have Osprey lose here, I think you frame it around the lack of really strong baby faces that AEW has right now. And
Mm,
to have Will Osprey and Swerve Strickland, two of your top, I don't know, 4 or 5 baby faces in the company right now, lose in a higher profile nature on this show, maybe that's pushing it. I mean, you look at the main event, who's getting involved after the main event? It's Christian Cage, it's Hangman
yeah,
Page. I mean, they're heels. And
yeah,
so you had like 18 heels in the main event segment and
yep,
2 baby faces, Jay White and Darby Allin. And Jay White is a newly turned babyface. So
right.
he's still kind of
Hilarious in his own
working
right.
to
Yeah,
earn that babyface trust with the audience. So I think if there is an argument to be made, it's not that Osprey's losing too much or Osprey's at risk of falling down the card because he's losing too much and fans will no longer see him as a top star. I just think it's AEW needs strong baby faces. Like they need baby faces to rack up wins, win after win after win. And any loss is going to, by definition, stunt their momentum. And when you this was another show that I think I didn't look at the numbers, but I think was pretty heel heavy with the victories. So I think that might be a concern. But
hmm
that's where my concern would lay if we're talking about the concerns of uh, Osprey losing here, more so than it doing any kind of long term damage to him.
yeah. Daryl Freeman in the chat via YouTube, just saying that Will hasn't been in the company for a year, and he's got too many losses. Greg, you kind of argued that the counterpoint to that, which I think is definitely a good point to make, that the fact that AEW just doesn't have the baby faces there at the top of the card right now. And I want to highlight another comment from Daryl because it leads us into to our next topic. The AEW women's title feels less than or almost on its last leg, even with what they tried tonight. It didn't get the reaction they wanted, and that's the thing we were going to talk about next. The championship celebration of Mariah May with Mina Shirakawa. Mina Shirakawa comes out onto the stage. She dances onto the stage. She introduces Mariah. Mariah basically says that she's beaten everybody. There's no one left for her to take care of, and she's run through the whole women's division in a matter of 3 months. And she's defeated Toni Storm and won the championship. It sort of sets the table for a return, maybe Toni Storm or a debut. But instead, what we get is the two of them dancing together in celebration, and Mariah turns on Mina, looking to hit her in the back with a champagne glass. Mina sees it coming. She kicks the glass away from Mariah, and then after a brief stare down, Mina spears Mariah May off of the stage through a couple of tables below. Mina comes up bloody in what I thought was a pretty cool moment. She comes up bleeding from the lip and the mouth, and she rubbed some of that blood on Mariah May's forehead. Greg, where are you at this? Are you with Daryl as far as the women's title kind of falling down the ranks? Did you think that this set things up nicely for the two of them? Where do you sit?
I'm not sure that was a Becky Lynch covered in blood in the stands moment for Mina Shirakawa, but it may, it may prove to be one of those images that we look back at as she goes forward in this feud with Mariah May and say, hey, maybe that was the start of something for her. This definitely did not transpire the way that I thought it would when it was first announced. I thought this was pretty clearly a way to get Toni Storm to return because that's what everybody's waiting for. Everybody's waiting for Toni Storm to return and at least attempt to get her revenge on Mariah May. And I thought having Mina Shirakawa in a situation where she may have to choose again between Mariah May and Toni Storm when Toni returns would be a kind of a side story to that they could use. So to have no sign of Toni Storm and then have Mariah try to turn on Mina Shirakawa was an interesting choice. I did like they had Mina see it coming and catch it. I mean, we have too many dumb baby faces in professional wrestling, so it is nice to see a
Yes.
baby face sort of catch the heel in the act a little bit, and I think that's going to bode well for Mina's character. So that I like how that played out. I thought her kick of the glass was really well done. I mean, that was pinpoint, and that's not easy to do.
Hmm.
So bravo to her for that. But again, I think the crowd likes Mina. They're going to buy her as a babyface challenger to Mariah May, but they're still waiting for Tony, right? That's the other shoe, pun intended, I suppose, to drop here in this storyline is it's never going to feel settled. It's never going to feel complete until Tony Storm comes back. So, how are fans going to react to this Mina Mariah feud, even though they like Mina, when they're really waiting for Tony Storm to come back? So, I really wonder about that and the timing of that and when that's going to be in the cards for AEW.
Yeah, to Daryl's point, saying that it didn't get the reaction that he thought that AEW wanted from the crowd. I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that by putting a segment like this on pay-per-view, you're sort of leading the audience into believe that there's either a debut coming or a return coming. And
Mhm.
when it's Tony Storm who's waiting in the wings and people are expecting her, anything short of that is going to feel like a bit of a disappointment, even if you have that big spot through the table. And I thought the crowd reacted, nicely for that when it happened. But there was a sense of some a bit of a letdown, a bit of
Mhm.
disappointment when they realized that it was just May turning on Shirakawa. I'm not as low on the division as a whole, but I don't think that it's been great. I mean, I think that they can certainly do a better job with the women's world title picture, especially given the match we saw from Mercedes Monet and Chris Statlander tonight. That felt like a real main event style match, and I just don't feel like we've ever hit that point with the women's world title. And Mariah May's reign, for as entertaining as she has been, has not felt like a world title reign. It's felt more like mid card fodder. And I think that a program with she and Nina, just given the way their characters behave, is unlikely to elevate itself to that, main event status.
I think too the problem with Mariah May's title run has been that her character from her introduction in the company to her title win has been completely about Tony Storm. Her character and every motivation that she's had has had to do with playing off of Tony Storm. And when you take Tony out of the equation, you've taken a great bit of the Mariah May character away. And I don't think they've
Mhm.
ever really compensated for that.
Yeah. So we move at this point to the second half of the show, which, by the way, I did, I often get on AEW for the rapid fire pace of match after match after match after match on these pay-per-views, because it can get, it sort of all blends together, and there's very little room to
Especially when you're
breathe.
typing up a report in real time, right?
E- exactly. But even when I haven't covered the show and I've just been watching it, I've thought, like, man, I would appreciate a quick interview here, like just a quick backstage segment rather than a really quick video package. Like,
Mm.
they did that a couple times tonight, and I thought it worked really well. The Orange Cassidy interview after the first match, which we can talk about with the main event, and then this Mina Shirakawa and Mariah May segment just broke up the action a little bit, gave the crowd a minute to breathe, and then we move on to the next thing, which in this case was TNT Championship match: Jack Perry and Daniel Garcia. This one a little bit longer than I was expecting. Daniel Garcia wins the TNT Championship in just over 18 minutes. Was the only title change on this show. He does it after, again, a match that was heavily revolving around working over the body parts, and to varying degrees of success. A good match. I thought that this is where the crowd started to die off just a bit. There were times where they came alive for this one, but Garcia has struggled to really find an identity for himself and really connect as a strong babyface. But I thought that they did, at the very least, a nice job of weaving into this the idea that there were stakes for AEW as a whole on the line. And by that, I mean, Jack Perry was very much viewed as an outsider in a different way than the Death Riders were in the main event. But even still, he represents sort of the anti sentiment of AEW. Whereas Daniel Garcia represents the hard workers, the conglomeration, the Matt Menards, the Orange Cassidys, the Danny Garcias, etc. The group of AEW diehards that have been there are going to continue to be there. They live, breathe AEW. And you saw that in the result of this. After Garcia wins the championship, he goes out into the crowd, he retrieves an AEW flag, and he drapes it over himself as he leaves. I thought it was a nice little touch because it carried that story and that momentum through the crux of the show. That this was about more than just a bunch of matches on a pay per view. This was about the soul of AEW and fighting back against outside forces, whether it be Jack Perry or it be the Death Riders. So I liked that touch. I thought the match was solid for what it was, but again, some struggling with getting Garcia to connect in a major way as a babyface. I don't know that a TNT title win is going to catapult him or completely change his trajectory, but I also don't know that the belt was doing anything for Perry either. So, what say you, Greg?
This was back down to the valleys, I think, and not that it's a bad match or anything like that, but I think you hit on it that Daniel Garcia is struggling to kind of connect as a babyface. Match was okay. I think this could be a really important. I think they said it was Daniel Garcia's first title win in AEW, which should be
Mhm.
meaningful for him going forward. And I like that AEW seems to be committed to the push of Daniel Garcia right now, which is important as we talk about the lack of really top baby faces in AEW. I just again I go back to the story, the soul of AEW, and you had Orange Cassidy earlier in the show cutting the promo about, if it wasn't for AEW, there'd be no Orange Cassidy, there'd be no Private Party, and it just feels very self-conscious on AEW's part when you are a company that is losing television viewers, even as you have this big television deal, when your attendance is weak for TV, that you're kind of pumping out this rah pro AEW stuff. It feels very self conscious of them to do that, and it's hard for me to get into that sort of thing. I mean, it's the same when WWE does it, right? I mean, this is kind of a different version of stand up for WWE in some ways,
Oh, come on, Greg. You don't like stand up for WWE?
It wasn't my favorite. Wasn't my favorite thing that WWE pushed on us. But I mean,
You didn't
it
put the
does.
hashtag in your Twitter bio?
I did not. At least I don't believe I did. No, I definitely did not. But it does feel kind of. I think pathetic might be going a little too far, but it does feel a little. Um, I get, like I go back to self-conscious. They're very,
Yeah.
they want to say, hey, we're important. What we do is important. Why aren't you watching us? Why aren't you coming to our shows? Look at all the great things we're doing and for all these wrestlers, and it feels kind of weird.
Yeah, yeah, I certainly agree with the notion. I mean, I would prefer that there wasn't a I don't know. I've always disliked promotion chants. Like it's not like a huge pet peeve of mine, but I didn't like it when they do it in NXT. I don't like it when there's just a huge AEW chant or it just I don't know. I'm conditioned to want the wrestlers to be the star of the show, not the promotion where you're just happy that the promotion is presenting you this really good match with wrestlers you like cheer for the wrestlers.
Yeah.
But that's a whole separate conversation. We got one of those chants in the next match, and I think every match left on the card. Match number 7, Konosuke Takeshita with Don Callis, seeing him for the second time tonight, facing Ricochet for the AEW International Championship. This match was added to the card late, if I am not mistaken. This one, they were heavy on emphasizing the result of the three-way match last month at Wrestle Dream that saw Konosuke Takeshita win the international championship, and he pinned Ricochet to do so. Another, I thought, good match that probably could have been left off of this show for the sake of brevity. I know we've talked about the fact that AEW just doesn't do that sort of thing, but this one might have gotten the cut for me if I was trimming the fat by one or two, just because it didn't seem to have the investment from the crowd, and I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that I just don't think that anybody bought the idea that Ricochet had a chance here. I mean, Konosuke Takeshita just winning the title last month. He's a heel on the upswing. There's clear momentum in the camp of the Don Callis family, based on Fletcher's win earlier in the night. And Ricochet, for as talented as he is, I think that we're really quickly learning that he is going to be really hard to make stand out in a company like AEW, because AEW has a dozen Ricochets, and that's just the unfortunate truth of it. I mean, he doesn't he his game is not elevated by his charisma. He is not an outstanding promo in the way that I think Will Osprey has developed into in certain respects.
Yeah.
He just doesn't have that extra gear to his game that I think is necessary for him to really stand out in a company that is loaded with guys who are just as talented, if not more talented than him in the ring. And it feels like they're trying really hard to make it work because they made an investment and they like the guy and the crowd likes the guy. I just don't think that they like him that much.
Whenever you're putting a pay-per-view card together, one of the things you should ask yourself is, what does this add to the show?
Mhm.
And I'm hard pressed to come up with an answer for Konosuke Takeshita versus Ricochet. I think best case scenario, you say, well, it adds another really good match to pair with Osprey and Fletcher. So you're
Mhm.
guaranteeing yourself those two really strong, just straight up wrestling matches. I think in execution, it didn't end up turning out that way. I think there was some disappointment, rightfully so, in Takeshita versus Ricochet for some of the reasons you list. He just, this is Ricochet now, and I look at this and I'm saying, Ricochet could be in WWE losing to secondary champions on pay-per-view. I mean, that's what he was
Yeah.
doing when he left, basically. And so did he gain much maybe in the pocketbook? I don't know, but did he gain much by going to AEW, at least right now, at least in this moment? I'm not sure that answer is yes, but
And the roster is so crowded. Where
yeah,
where do you see him
yeah,
age
variety
like
of
can he
opponents.
elevate?
I think he can. But I think he has more of a ceiling than maybe we thought, just in what we've
Mhm.
seen of him lately for a lot of the reasons you listed. He doesn't stand out the same way that he did in WWE. He doesn't come across. He doesn't have the character, the same promo skills of some of the other wrestlers who could do the same things that he can in the ring, if not better. So if you're looking to push Ricochet, but you say, well, we have Ricochet over here who's 5 years younger and can cut better promos. I mean, there's your answer. So I think there is some goodwill that he has and some name value. People still like him and look at him as someone who is underutilized for much of his run in WWE. So they're going to get
Mhm.
something out of that in AEW. But that's not going to last forever. I mean, that goodwill, I don't think, And again, this was a good match, but people went into this with super high expectations. I mentioned kind of pairing it with Osprey and Fletcher, and I think Osprey and Fletcher was clearly head and shoulders above this match on this night.
Definitely. Yeah, and I mean they're intrinsically tied to not just the match, but the two characters. I mean the two, Osprey and Ricochet are are always going to be compared and contrasted and paired, whether fairly or unfairly, because of that the acrobatic match in 2017 on the Indies. And I think that there were a lot of people who thought that maybe when they were in the same company again as major stars, they would be viewed as contemporaries. But I felt like as soon as they were placed opposite each other, it didn't make Ricochet burn brighter. It didn't make Ricochet feel like a
I
bigger
think it
star.
exposed how much Osprey has
Exactly.
developed since those days in ways that Ricochet hasn't.
Exactly. And that's what I was getting to. It made it just how clear of a gap there now is between the two of them. And I don't think that has done Ricochet any favors since, because I think the crowd senses that. I think that they sense that there is a sizable gap between those two guys. I also didn't think that it helped that the finish to this match was the same as the Fletcher and Osprey match. I mean, it looked a little bit different. I mean, in my report for pwtorch, I called what Takeshita did like a brainbuster Falcon Arrow off the top, but it was basically the same move. It was the same finish. So to have two guys, in the Callis family finish off the same way, I mean, I guess you can point to the idea that, like, they're training
It's the
together
coaching of
and
Don
whatnot.
Callis
But
coming into play.
yeah, I just, again, I think it's just, you've got to have your producers linking up on these things, and
Mhm.
having clearer delineations and designations between these matches.
For sure.
Anything before we move on to the last couple of matches here?
Nope, I don't think so.
All right, so we will head to our semi-main event, the pay-per-view debut and the in-ring debut in AEW for one Bobby Lashley. It was Swerve Strickland with Prince Nana taking on Bobby Lashley, who was accompanied to the ring by his Hurt Syndicate cohorts MVP and Shelton Benjamin. Bobby Lashley gets the win here. We teased it earlier on. Will Osprey, one major AEW babyface to fall. Swerve Strickland was the other, losing to Bobby Lashley here in a little over 13 minutes. And for the first 5 or so minutes of this one, I was wondering if we were getting a John Cena Brock Lesnar SummerSlam 2014 moment where
Mhm.
Lashley was just going to murder Swerve Strickland and pin him. And they even teased it where Lashley slammed Swerve like in the first 2 minutes of the match and actually lifted his shoulder off the mat. Swerve did not visibly kick out, and so it looked like Lashley could have pinned him just a couple of minutes in. But the match picked up in intensity after that. Swerve got a lot of offense in. They did a lot of stuff on the outside. I came away from this match feeling like Bobby Lashley in AEW is sort of the antithesis of Ricochet in AEW,
Yeah.
where if Ricochet is a guy that comes in from WWE and immediately merges into traffic and looks like 10 other guys they have on the roster, Bobby Lashley is the guy that comes in and looks like absolutely no one else.
Mhm.
Lashley is a guy who stood out in WWE, but they had other guys who matched up physically with Lashley, who worked the same style as Lashley. AEW does not have that. And so Lashley looked like a different breed of big man here. I was running down the list trying to think of other guys who, move similarly to the way he does, who work the way that he does, and they just don't have anyone like him. And so I came away feeling like, man, the sky is the limit for Lashley here, depending on what they want to do and how they want to present him. I don't know if at his age you want to be putting him in the AEW world title picture if you want to sort of keep him relegated as a sideshow attraction the way that this was built to be, but he looks different. And
Mhm.
I thought Swerve made him look like $1 million. His offense looked incredible. You know, they gave Swerve enough offense so that this didn't look like just an overwhelming barrage. But this was a clear indication that, man, they see something here with Lashley, and the Hurt Syndicate is meant to be a big deal.
Hey, we're heading from the valley back to the peak again here with Lashley versus Swerve. I agree with you on Lashley. I thought this was kind of a best case scenario debut for him in terms of how he looked. And you mentioned the age and maybe not wanting to expose him to a world title match, or certainly not wanting to have him wrestle every week. I think you put him out there wearing a suit. I think he looks great. I think he's the guy that, break glass in case of emergency wrestling for the Hurt
Mhm.
Syndicate. Like if Shelton Benjamin can't handle it, if it's too big of a deal for him, or whoever else joins, whether it's Max Caster, whoever else ends up joining Hurt Syndicate, if their problem is too big for those guys to solve, then you bring in Bobby Lashley to fight. And that's kind of how
Yeah.
I'd use him going forward sparingly, because you have other members of the Hurt Syndicate who can wrestle more often, maybe. But yeah, this was really good. I mean, when that whole scenario was playing out in the first couple minutes of Lashley just dominating Swerve, I was kind of thinking, hell, maybe it's not a bad idea. Maybe you have Lashley beat him in 2 or 3 minutes and sort of not reset the Swerve babyface character, but give him a real mountain to climb. Okay. Because not only is he losing, but he's losing in such a dominant fashion. He needs to go back to the drawing board somewhat. What does that look like for him, for that character that is built on confidence, right? So
Mhm.
what does he have to do now to regain that confidence that's lost in such a painful manner? Ultimately, they decided to have a more even match as things played out, but still a relatively um, not necessarily dominant all the way through, but it was a definite statement for Bobby Lashley in this victory. And so,
Swerve's offense was all opportunistic. It never felt
yeah,
like it felt like he had to catch breaks to get something in on Lashley.
sure. Yeah, and so this was a good win for Lashley here. I go back to some of the same things I talked about with Will Osprey losing. It is a little risky because you've got now your two of your top baby faces who've lost here. You throw in Orange Cassidy, that's three out of the top four baby faces in your company probably losing on this show. In a company that is really hard up for baby faces right now. But you put yourself in a position by your booking that Lashley has to go over. I mean, he's debuting. It's on pay-per-view. It's in the semi-main event. You're not going to have him lose in that scenario. Now, maybe you protect Swerve on the loss. There's enough people out at ringside to create chaos and a situation where maybe Lashley wins, but it's not clean, or there's some wonkiness with the finish. But that's I'd always err on going clean when you can. And this was a stoppage. Swerve didn't get pinned. He, lost consciousness in the hurt lock. So he's got a little bit of a caveat there for losing. But I thought this was really played well throughout this match.
Yeah, it definitely was. I thought, like you said, it was one of the highlights of the show. It gives me a lot of intrigue to see where they're going to go with both of these characters coming out of this. I mean, I assume that they're going to be intertwined for a bit, but I think there's interesting paths for both of them, and I do think that it gives them the opportunity for a bit of a reset, like you said with Swerve, which is an interesting prospect to think about because they've had a hard time transitioning him out of first the Hangman Page feud and then losing the title to Bryan Danielson. So
Mhm.
I think there are some interesting avenues that they can take here. Uh, I'm glad that we got through the majority of the card here in pretty good time because I had a feeling we were going to spend the most amount of time on the main event and the aftermath. I know the majority of
Now
the
we
comments in the
haven't even gotten to the real main event, which of course is Big Boom AJ against QT Marshall. We got to talk
that's
about that
true.
before we go, Brandon,
The,
because
yeah,
I mean,
we'll shift to that now. I did see
oh,
some comments in the chat talking about that and saying that it may have been that the Rizzler may have been the most overact on the show. Rizilla saying AEW roster couldn't follow the Rizzler, and Joshua White following up should be a joke, but he might have gotten the biggest pop of the night. Greg, I will turn this over to you. I was setting up my station for coverage of the main show. I did not catch any of Zero Hour. I'm sort of glad I didn't. I didn't really want to see the Costco guys, but you can fill me in.
well, I you know my rule is I don't watch the pre-shows, but I had to tune in to watch this. I watched Collision, or I'm sorry, Rampage, and saw the weigh-in. And keep in mind, I have no idea who these people are. Like, I have no idea. My wife is on social media a lot, and I'm like, have you ever heard of these people? And she had never heard of him. My 7-year-old
Okay.
stepson had heard of the Rizzler. So, I mean, there's that. But I had not ever heard. And the funniest part was Excalibur trying to introduce them and basically say what they're famous for without saying Costco, because apparently they're not an AEW sponsor. So he's, trying to explain that they go to this, uh, this American warehouse store. It was just kind of weird how he had to kind of uh, not say the brand throughout this whole thing. But look, I mean, this is pro wrestling. Like, this was an example of what pro wrestling is, and the fans ate it up. And maybe it would have sucked a lot more if the fans didn't care about these people or had never heard of them. But the fact that the fans were into it, I mean, it was a simple match. It was not anything extraordinary. Lasted 12
Mhm.
minutes. Big Justice comes in and spears QT Marshall to end it, and they all three of them play to the crowd at the end. But it's amazing how entertaining wrestling can be when it's kept so simple. And this was the simplest kind of booking that you can get. It was what you would imagine celebrity involvement of wrestling is, and it was Americana, Brandon. It was pro wrestling. It was apple pie and baseball, and it was just that very simple stuff that's kind of lost in trying to complicate storylines and trying to you know, uh, surprise the fans and bring things out of left field when it's kept simple, even with guys I've never heard of. It was damn entertaining, and I'll give them all credit for that. All the folks involved in this played their part so well, and I was fully ready to come on here and to make fun of it, but I can say unironically how entertaining the whole segment was.
The one thing that I will say is that I haven't seen it. I haven't seen it firsthand, and I'm not going to go look for it. But I can bet that there are a lot of people on various avenues of social media who are staunch supporters of AEW who will go to the ends of the earth to defend this while simultaneously knocking WWE for every time they've done similar cross promotion.
Yeah, you got to do it right though. And
Sure,
WWE's
they
gotten it
don't
right.
always.
They don't always. They've gotten it more right than usual lately. I mean, if you're talking about someone who's just going to rag on WWE for using celebrities, period, then yeah, that's
That's
clearly
more of the
talking out of both sides of your mouth here. Um, but yeah, they for a company that doesn't do a bunch with celebrities like AEW, they nailed this one.
Yeah,
And
I
they
mean,
kept it and they kept it on the pre-show, which was smart, because if you're putting this
yes,
on the
yep,
main show and putting it in the middle of the show, I'm not sure that the fans would have as much patience for it
no,
as they did on the pre-show. So that was smart too.
definitely, and I think there's something to be said too for the fact that the reason I haven't harped on this with any with any seriousness is just because I think that I think that we have in the past on this show and in on others that I've been a part of discussed the fact that there have been many times where AEW has foregone, passed up, or blanked on opportunities for crossover appeal that could expand their audience. We've talked about, for example, getting their championships out in the sports world, the way that WWE has, and how huge of a cheap partnership that has become for WWE to make their
Mhm.
titles synonymous with championships in the sports world. And AEW, with their football team owning owner, uh, hasn't thought of doing something similar. Um,
Well, the Jaguars aren't
I
going to be
th-
winning championships anytime soon, and
sure. Well,
I say that as a staunch Jaguars fan.
I I didn't want
It,
to rub it in. I didn't
it's
want
going
to
to
rub
be
it
a
in.
while. What a terrible season. But anyway,
Uh, so I think that there is a place for this stuff if you do it right, if you can get the crossover appeal. And I'm sure that there are eyes that were on Zero Hour tonight, and they probably didn't translate into buyers because curiosity is rarely going to turn into a $50 commitment the first time around. But maybe it turns into a commitment to check out Dynamite on Wednesday. And
mhm.
that's a huge plus at the end of the day because they certainly can use the help in the ratings department, in the attendance department. All of that stuff can help. And so if they can do something tastefully like this, then by all means, especially if it doesn't get in the way of your main product.
Mhm.
The last match we're going to talk about, and like I said, I assume that there will be some discussion here, both in terms of the match itself, the execution of it, what it meant in general for the company as a whole, and then what the closing segment means. As I mentioned previously, the majority of comments we got in the chat were centered around this and how it made them feel about the show as a whole. I'm talking about Jon Moxley versus Orange Cassidy for the AEW World Championship. Jon Moxley, no surprise, retaining the championship here in just over 19 minutes. He does so after a plethora of interference, some false finishes, a little bit of false hope for Orange Cassidy. Biggest, not necessarily surprise, but biggest talking point in the match itself is the just massive flurry of offense from Orange Cassidy to start the match out. He explodes on Moxley with three orange punches. The fight goes outside very quickly, and within just minutes, Moxley busts Cassidy wide open, and very quickly the blood becomes the story of the match. I thought, to their credit, using blood incredibly sparingly tonight. We saw a little bit in that Mina Shirakawa segment with Mariah May, but other than that, relegating it primarily here to the main event. And Cassidy bled a lot, and it was the story of this match. Moxley was covered from head to toe in Cassidy's blood, so much so that like it soiled a huge spot of his pants on his thigh, where it was just soaked through with Cassidy's blood, all over his chest. It stains his chest, dried handprints, the whole 9 yards. And Cassidy doesn't stop bleeding throughout the course of the 19 minutes. This was an interesting main event, to say the least. And Greg, I'll let you talk about anything you want to regarding the match. But first, I want to get your thoughts on this match, knowing the things that you said earlier about sort of the rah rah AEW thing that was an overarching theme through many of the matches on this show, and seeing that Orange Cassidy was the leader of that. Do you feel like Orange Cassidy in 2024 was a suitable, credible main event challenger for a world championship in what has historically been one of your biggest pay-per-views of the year?
I think that's kind of a leading question, but I'm going to go against it. I'm going to say yes.
Okay.
I think, I talked earlier about Hangman Page and how I've enjoyed his character. I think it's one of the more well-rounded characters in AEW. I think the same thing of Orange Cassidy. I think that character, as strange as it may sound, is one of the more well-rounded characters that we've seen. He's a guy who kind of just wants to go out and wrestle. Like he doesn't he doesn't want to he's being dragged kicking and screaming into this leadership role that he doesn't really want,
Mhm.
but he sees no one around him willing to stand up for a company that he acknowledges wouldn't exist if it wasn't for this company. So he feels he owes something to AEW, and right now that takes the form of standing up to John Moxley and this group who wants to destroy what
Mhm.
AEW is all about, and because that means destroying Orange Cassidy's career, basically. So I like that. We've seen Cassidy's wrestling style, which is just leaving everything out there, which sort of goes against his very laid back and lackadaisical character, but I think it works. So no, I think it's fine. He and Moxley have a history. They fought at Full Gear last year. The announcers brought that up, and
Mhm.
I think Orange Cassidy won that. So he has victories over John Moxley. This was not a guy going into this match that just was like over against John Moxley in their career and just felt out of place in this situation. So I didn't have a problem. I think, especially when you look at it, you take a step back and you look at it, and this is going to be the first match in probably a lengthy John Moxley title run. I think having
Mhm.
Orange Cassidy be the first, where it's not necessarily a guy that you really believe is going to win that title already from Moxley, because that would completely destroy this very long term arc that they're telling with John Moxley and the Death Riders. But to be the first guy to stand up to Moxley, I think it's good use of Orange Cassidy, because he's not going to lose much here by losing. It may actually gain something by being catapulted into the main event against Moxley and getting a hell of a near fall late in the match against John Moxley, where even the non-believers who didn't think Cassidy deserved or had earned this spot or made sense in this spot or whatever the excuse is, even those people had to at least partially buy into that near fall toward the end. So, I mean, based on all the post match stuff, it does seem like it's one and done for Cassidy, which again is fine. But I thought for a first challenger for Moxley, I liked Cassidy given his ties to AEW, given his history with John Moxley, and some of the other character traits that he's shown over the last few months and years.
Yeah, I'm with you there, and I was certainly leading the question because not because I thought that this was a bad route to take for the title match, but more because I wonder, big picture, if this is the angle that best serves AEW as a whole. So I think stipulating to the idea that they're doing what they're doing, and Mox is, going down this path. I'm with you 100%. I think that Cassidy, bearing the flag for AEW, being that guy, makes a lot of sense. And to be the one to take the fall and to reluctantly step into the role of leader and leave it all in the ring, get the near fall, as you mentioned. I'm fine with all of that, and I thought that this worked pretty well for what it set out to do. I think that my conundrum is more along the lines of, when you look up and down the roster and you see the talent that's there, and you look at where they're positioned, is are they making the best use of the main event scene that they can, when you have the likes of Swerve Strickland, Will Osprey, you know, Konosuke Takeshita on the rise? You have, and unfortunately, there's a small list of baby faces right now, but namely guys like Swerve Strickland, guys like Will Osprey. You have Hangman Page, who at one point was at the top of that card. Jay White, who may be moving now into that role. I guess where I'm going with this is you have such a large roster. How 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 beneficial is it to continue to have all of these guys who the majority of the fan base is viewing as main event acts working the undercard while we have these secondary programs that are less about the babyface at hand, in this case Orange Cassidy, and more about the whole of AEW, the soul of AEW. Is the John Moxley tears AEW apart from within, is that the best use of the company's main event time right now?
A lot of places I can go with this. I think that, with AEW running now almost a pay-per-view every month, you
Mhm.
can't have Will Osprey in the pay-per-view main event every month. You can't
Right.
have Swerve Strickland in the pay-per-view main event every month. So I'm all for cycling through. And there's going to be
Mhm.
some months that Will Osprey isn't in the main event, some months that Swerve Strickland isn't in the main event, and some months they are. I don't have a problem with John Moxley as champion right now. I think there are some issues with the storyline for sure.
Yeah.
But John Moxley as AEW champion right now and in the main event of a pay per view doesn't seem that strange to me, and doesn't seem like when you look at the issues that are plaguing AEW, John Moxley as champion in the main event is not in my top 30 probably. So I don't have a problem with that. So now you're talking challengers, right? Okay, and again, I go back to my point of what Orange Cassidy is the perfect first opponent for John Moxley. A year from now, if John Moxley is still champion and we haven't seen John Moxley versus Swerve Strickland or John Moxley versus Will Ospreay, okay,
Mhm.
then maybe there's an issue there. But those are guys that you get to compare it to a video game. Those are the guys you get to last, right? you,
Mhm.
you have to get through the Orange Cassidys and
Sure.
some of the lesser baby faces before you get to the top guys. And so that's kind of how I see that. It's going to be problematic when you have a heel champion in John Moxley, because you've got these baby faces that you listed, but only one can main event at a time, and you
Mhm.
don't want to give away, especially when you're so um, early on in the run of the heel champion. You can't just give away those matches early on in their run in the main events. So I'm not as concerned about that as you are. Like I said, I'm concerned about just the positioning and the number of quality main event level baby faces that AEW has. But I'm not really concerned about the order, I guess, that they're using them in terms of the main events.
Yeah, I'm not so much concerned about the order or even I think Moxley is a good representation, especially as a heel. It's a fresh character for him. It's not something we've seen him do in AEW. I think that my concern stems from this idea that until we get more exposition on what Moxley's MO is, and so far we're a little over 2 months into this character, and we've learned nothing. We've learned nothing about what his motivation might be. He speaks mostly in riddles. Is there a higher power? Is there not? Is it just him, acting alone with his cohorts? Until we get exposition at some level, it feels like we're going to be in this never-ending cycle of John Moxley is holding AEW hostage, and his babyface challenger of the month has to stand up for AEW. And I worry
Ye-
about
Yeah.
the longevity of that, if that's what we're going to see.
Yeah, it does seem like it's going to redound every AEW babyface character that challenges Moxley to, okay, this is simply the next guy to step up to defend AEW against
Right.
Moxley. And how many different incarnations of that story can you tell over the long term? They told one with Orange Cassidy. I'm sure they'll be telling one next with Darby Allin because he kind of fits into that Orange Cassidy mold of
Mhm.
AEW gave me a chance when no one else would.
Right,
So
right.
we'll see if they go for a repeat of that. Jay White, I see, is a little different whenever they get to Jay White versus John Moxley, which they teased tonight. I don't think he has that same argument that Darby Allin and Orange Cassidy do in defending AEW.
Or
So
shouldn't,
I'm
at least.
right, shouldn't. So I'm interested to see what angle they come at that with. Um, but yeah, I think as fans, we want mystery, but we
Mhm.
also want answers to those mysteries, like in a timely manner. And I say,
Yeah.
if we don't start getting some answers within the next month, I think you're going to see fans get a lot more restless about this character and about this storyline.
Yeah.
Um, because you've got to make some connections somewhere along the way for the fans. And so I'm hoping we get that over the next few weeks.
And we have a recent history too of them doing this long payoff that ends with a thud, and that being, of course, the devil. So
Yeah.
where we had multiple months of retread where there was minimal exposition, repeating the same sort of generalized lines and generalized ideas, and then it lands with a thud, and people are, rightfully calling it the worst angle that AEW has produced, I think, since
Hmm.
its inception. So that's kind of the thing that I worry about with this, and what I think about long term. I hope that we start to get a little bit of information. I don't need John Moxley to come out on Wednesday and say, here is my, here's the book, here's everything that I've been talking about. But I would like to see there be just a little bit of progression week to week, however that may be. Tracy Bell in the chat earlier mentioning that it's nice to see they're mixing in upper card people with the Death Rider story. We touched on that a little bit, Greg, but certainly wanted to get into it a little bit more because it moves us on from the match itself and into the post match angle, which I thought dragged this down a bit. It was nice to see, as Tracy mentioned, other wrestlers get involved and wrestlers who you want to see involved with the Death Riders, because there have been a lot of underwhelming baby faces so far. I mean, when the Death Riders are overtaking AEW and the best you can muster is Dark Order to defend the company, you've got a serious problem. So, to have Orange Cassidy step up, to see Jay White come out tonight, like those are all net positives. To get Hangman Page involved in the story, to get Christian Cage, even though their motivations are separate and different, I think that is all a positive. Darby Allin, of course, getting involved in the closing segment. What I didn't like was the convoluted nature of the closing segment. Um, and I want to highlight a comment here from Rude Dog, frequent guest of the show. He was in attendance tonight. He said people were having a blast, but everyone was scratching their head at the ending. Greg, take it away. What did you make of the closing segment, the post match angle?
I did like how the baby faces came out in more of a timely manner to help out, which was nice. When
Mhm.
Claudio and Pac came out, it didn't take 20 minutes for the baby faces to come out and sort of stop them. So that was an improvement. But yeah, it just felt like too much going on at the end to have to process after sitting through
Mhm.
4 hours of AEW television. So that would be my main complaint is, you could have done something where Darby just you have the Darby thing at the end, um, and not have all the other stuff there. Christian coming out, Jay White coming out. Now, the good thing is it does set in motion potential future feuds. You could do Moxley versus Jay White. You could do Moxley versus Darby Allin. You could do Moxley versus Hangman Page, I guess, at some point if you
Sure.
wanted to. Who knows where Hangman Page is going to be 3 to 6 months from now as a character? You know, he's complicated. So, um, Moxley versus Christian Cage. I don't really know. That seems to me more of Christian trying to cash in and be a weasel than any kind of actually long-term feud or even month-long feud with John Moxley. I don't see that. So it does set the foundation for when we're looking back at 3 months from now and Jay White's facing John Moxley. We can say that it started here and this was the foundation for it, and it built from here to there, which is nice to be able to do. But I guess my big complaint is after 4 hours of wrestling, you have boom, 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 all happening within 5 minutes. And it was just kind of a lot to take in and a lot to process.
Yeah, Decline in the chat via YouTube said that ending gave bad NWO vibes, and I guess I wouldn't go. I didn't think quite that lowly of it, but I agree. It was messy. It was convoluted. It was too much for a show that already had a lot going on, and I think that they're painted into a corner in some respects with the Christian Cage thing because Cage won that contract when the Moxley thing hadn't come to fruition yet, and I think at some point I had heard that there was talk of Darby Allin winning the title from Bryan Danielson initially. And if that was the case, then it would make sense for a guy like Christian Cage to be waiting in the wings with a contract. And that would be a very logical feud for Darby Allin. So I understand why they did it. But now that that is not a reality, and now that it seems like it's pretty unlikely that Allen would defeat Moxley this early on in the title reign, it kind of leaves them between a rock and a hard place where Cage has this contract. It only makes sense that he's going to consider using it, and yet the character of Christian Cage would almost never insert himself in a position where he needs to deal with a guy like John Moxley, even if it means trying to get his hands on the AEW world title, because Moxley and the Death Riders are so dangerous. And I think Christian knows that whether they're on the same, plane or not, as far as fan designation, he's smart enough to know that getting in Moxley's way would be perilous to his own survival. So I think that they're in a sticky situation there. They tried to play it out a little bit tonight, but it felt like after a, a, a match that had a downer of an ending, and that's fine. You're gonna have downer endings to pay-per-view matches, especially when you have a heel champion. Heel champion retains, the babyface comes up short. There's a beatdown. The Death Riders are furthering, their dominance, and the crowd is naturally deflated. And then you have a series of run-ins that I think were aimed at bringing the crowd back up and sending them home happy in the name of chaos. But none of the run-ins, save for Hangman Page, generated the type of reaction that they were looking for. And there was also disappointment in the Hangman Page run-in because I think people thought that he was going to step up to John Moxley because he's crazy and he's the next guy who's going to defend AEW's honor. So when they didn't get that, there was another round of disappointment. And then the actual comeuppance, the only moment of feel good clarity that you get, happens out of the arena in the parking lot to close the show. So it felt like a series of unfortunate events that pushed the crowd further down the rabbit hole of, well, this isn't a very satisfying conclusion. And Rude Dog kind of alluded to that with his mention of the live crowd, where they're just sort of left scratching their head because all of this stuff happened, but none of it is very satisfying.
Yeah, and it's it's going to take some explaining. The Page relationship with Christian Cage coming out there and preventing him from cashing in, and everything. There's a lot of threads to pull on TV going
Mm.
forward, and that's kind of what it felt like. Like this was a way to get people to tune into TV to have a lot of these questions answered. And so the unsatisfying nature I think that you talk about is hit on there. But yeah, it almost feels like Christian is going to have to cash in at what he feels is an opportune time and then lose,
Hmm.
but lose in a way that branches him off into a feud with whoever costs him the loss. Like, just kind of have Mox wash his hands of Christian and just say, beat him, but then move on to something else and have Christian try to get revenge on whoever cost him that. Just have
Yeah.
Christian and Mox interact as little as possible, basically, I guess is what I'm saying, because their
Yeah.
characters just don't mix as opposition right now in any kind of way that would benefit either character, I don't think. So it does feel like Christian won that opportunity in a very distant past where this Moxley character did not exist and was not champion. So now that he is on the scene as champion, they've got to figure out, okay, Christian's not going to beat him for the title. You may not even want him to cash in. He may hold it until Moxley loses, which I don't know. That's a long time, but I think Christian as a character with this opportunity, I think I think having this opportunity to cash in whenever he wants basically helps his character. I think it's beneficial to his character to have this. So, um, they may want him to hold it as long as possible because he's kind of that Weasley character um, who needs this to kind of feel important and to hang over others' heads.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Last question I will pose to you, Greg, here, as far as the overarching show itself goes. This one from Jack London on YouTube a little earlier. Who's in charge? Who is pulling the strings for John Moxley and company?
Yeah, I mean that's a question that has a lot of different parts to it because it's who's in charge of Moxley's group, but also who's in charge of AEW. You've got Christopher Daniels, you've
Hmm.
got Tony Khan um as an authority figure. You got the Young Bucks who have taken their EVP status on screen as part of their characters. So I think that's a multifaceted question, and I think that's a bad question to have your fans asking. I think if your fans are asking that question, you've erred somewhere along the way. And so that's not a great look for AEW to have fans asking that question. But as far as who's in charge of the Moxley group, Shane McMahon is the popular pick. I don't know that I really buy that. Um, it makes sense on some
I
levels,
I
but
stopped believing in the notion of it being Shane when he posed for that picture with the Bucks at the airport. I just kind of felt like, you know, if there's any truth to this, then why would they do that? Why
yeah,
would they why would it just I I I would want that to be I would want the first time you see Shane in with any relation to AEW whatsoever to be the first time he shows up on TV, not some picture at the airport with the Bucks. I mean, I get it. I get that they're trolling in some respect, but like that that to me was more of a yeah, it's not him.
you also have to consider the fact that maybe when this angle started, they didn't know who was going to be in
That's yeah,
charge. And
that's
then
true.
all of a sudden, it could be, hey, we talked to Shane earlier. Let's reach out and
Mhm.
see if he's interested. So it
Yeah.
could be at the time they maybe not did not have any plans to use him, but then all of a sudden this opportunity came up. So I mean, I don't know. It could be the voices in Moxley's head for all I know that are in charge. I don't know that we'll ever know. I think they've been vague enough to where I'm not even sure if it's going to be a person that's revealed as this higher power in charge. I don't have a lot of confidence that that is where they're going with this. But I don't know. It's again, having fans asking that question is not. I don't think that's a great place to be in if you're AEW.
Yeah, I agree. All right, before we wrap things up here, I am just going to throw a quick shout out. If you are not already a PW Torch member, you can become one. It's a great time to maybe sign up here before we get into the crux of WrestleMania season at the start of the year. Maybe a nice little Christmas gift to yourself. pwtorch.com/go VIP. You get ad-free podcasts, VIP only podcasts, the 35 years of podcasts and newsletter archives, so much more. A whole bunch of exclusive shows, including The Fix with Todd Martin, the post-event roundtable podcast, which I am an occasional guest on. Wade Keller Hotlines, everything with Rich and Wade, and of course my co-host tonight, Greg Parks' show, Greg Parks Out Loud. Greg, do you want to? You want to plug that one a little bit?
I would. Thank you, Brandon. I just recorded the latest earlier today, actually. I For those who don't know, Greg Parks Out Loud is where I read my column that I write every week in the Torch newsletter out loud, and have an opportunity to expand on some of my thoughts and give additional um, ideas and comments that don't fit into the 1,500 words that I write for my column. So this coming week in the Torch newsletter, I wrote a column looking back at a column that I wrote a year ago about the soon to be free agents in professional wrestling at the start of 2024. I wrote a column about some of them and where they might end up. So I looked back at that column and looked back to those wrestlers and wrote about where they did indeed end up in 2024 and how they performed in that company. Would they have been better off going somewhere else? So that's my column that will appear in this week's Torch newsletter. And then I read that for Greg Parks Out Loud and was able to talk a little bit more in depth about some of my thoughts. So I recorded that today. That should be out in the coming days on pwtorch.com for VIP members.
Perfect. So, like Greg said, you can catch both his written columns in the PW Torch newsletter and also him reading the columns along with additional analysis and opining from the one and only Greg Parks in as part of your VIP subscription. Greg, before we shut this thing down, I just want to get overall thoughts. Thumbs up, thumbs down, thumbs in the middle on Full Gear 2024.
Slight thumbs up, I think. There was enough good here to outweigh, and I don't think the bad was necessarily terrible. It was just kind of there. We've had some AEW shows where there's been some real head scratching booking in the past. I didn't really think there was a lot of that here tonight. But I also didn't think it was at the level of some of the AEW pay-per-views we've seen as recently as this year. That were in that 9 to 9.5 range. I didn't think this quite lived up to that, but I think there was enough good on this show to give it a slight thumbs up.
Yeah, I'm in a similar boat. I definitely thought that this was a stronger show overall than say Wrestle Dream last month, which I was a little bit lower on, but I certainly wasn't as high on it as some of the better shows earlier in the year. I thought that there was some really good wrestling, some high highs. And then just some head scratchers, kind of as the comments mentioned. The main event or the post main event angle put a damper on things a bit for me because of the tone it struck and the way that the crowd sort of the way it sort of deflated the crowd. And I get that you're going to have those moments on shows like this when you have a heel going over, but it felt a little disjointed, a little overstimulating, like they were trying to overcompensate for the finish a little bit too much, and so that drags it down a little bit. But I do give it a mild thumbs up overall. Greg, before I let you go, you've already plugged Greg Parks Out Loud. let people know what else you do for the Torch and where they can find you on social media.
Yeah, on social media, I'm still on Twitter/X at Greg M Parks, but I'm also at Blue Sky as well at Greg M Parks. So you can follow me there if you are one of the many who've migrated over to that social media platform. Tweeting my thoughts, posting my thoughts, I guess, is the more accurate description on both platforms throughout the night tonight and going forward during events, Raw, SmackDown, whenever I'm able to watch it live, certainly pay-per-views. And I also write a Parks's Take for pwtorch.com. That is on the free side and for VIP members. So if you're not a VIP member, you can still check out my thoughts at least once a week in a shorter form, Parks's Take on pwtorch.com.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Greg. Glad to have you here again. You know, I said at the start of the show that this is only my third time hosting Wrestling Night in America, and two of them have been with you. So you can't get rid of me. I can't get rid of you. But it's fine. I'm happy about it.
Yeah, don't get used to it. It's going to happen a lot less often coming up soon. So,
all right. Thanks, Greg.
of course.
So that is going to do it for Wrestling Night in America. I am Brandon LeClair. You can find me in my work for pwtorch doing the post pay-per-view Wrestling Night in Americas, post PLE Wrestling Night in Americas. I also provide the alt perspective reports for WWE pay-per-views and AEW PLEs. I'm also an occasional co-host with Wade Keller on the pwtorch Pro Wrestling Post shows. That was a mouthful. For those of you, all of our VIP members, thank you so much for joining us in the chat and contributing with your questions. And hope those listening on demand enjoy this in the morning or whenever you may be checking this out. I will be back more than likely next weekend covering WWE Survivor Series. We've got another pay-per-view in less than a week's time. So you can more than likely catch me on another edition of Wrestling Night in America then, as well as find my coverage for PW Torch at pwtorch.com. And until then, this has been Wrestling Night in America.